The sales team needs leads. This was true 100 years ago. It's true today, and it'll be true 100 years from now. Well, we're back together again.
We certainly are. We were just joking before we jumped on. It feels like it was a couple of months ago since we did one of these, but it's actually almost a year, I think, since we've actually been on a LinkedIn Live, right?
Yeah, I think so.
All right. Well, we have
time flies.
Depressingly so. Well, luckily we're coming back strong, and we're coming back with about as meaty a topic as I think we could have possibly started off on. And for everyone joining, this was sort of a conversation that you and I had like last week where we were just chatting away, and you had brought up what I think might be one of the more controversial takes in the B2B tech world, that the MQL that we all love to hate on might not actually be as dead as we have been claiming it has been for probably about 10 years now. Tell me more.
Well, is it dead, or is it just pining for the fjords? I mean, it's interesting. I think everyone loves to, run the clickbait headlines that, whatever it is that everyone's using is now dead. And, and so the MQL is dead has been a trope now for probably 3 or 4 years.
Oh, longer than that. There was a literal book from Drift on the MQL is dead, and that's at least 8 years ago.
Yeah. But, so the question is, if it's not dead, why wouldn't it be dead? Because it certainly isn't working very well. And, and most of the suggestions for what's supposed to replace it aren't working any better. But I think the key thing is, and the reason why the MQL isn't dead, is that in B2B organizations where you have an established sales function, the sales team needs leads. This was true 100 years ago. It's true today, and it'll be true 100 years from now. That if there isn't a function in the business that's generating leads for sales to work on, then sales has to spend a considerable portion of their time going out doing cold outreach instead of closing deals. And so marketing exists to be able to make sure that sales is busy, but busy closing deals and not busy out doing cold outbound, which is not very efficient because they're doing it one by one, where marketing can do the equivalent of cold outbound, on a one-to-many basis. You can reach lots and lots of people with a single ad or a single campaign, at very low cost, even if most of those people aren't going to buy. But the other issue there is so long as there's a separate function in the business that has some level of responsibility for generating leads, then there's got to be an interface between the marketing function and the sales function. And that interface is the point at which marketing decides that, a contact in the database is now worthy of the sales organization investing in trying to close the deal. Doesn't necessarily mean they're in market, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to buy, but it means that there's some evidence that this lead, if you were to work on this lead, there would be some increased probability that it would eventually result in a close. And marketing has to decide that.
So I think there's an important thing that's probably worth stepping back on, and to give, for the sake of it, I think like a bit of a brief history lesson, because on one hand, you're talking about something that is a universal truth that I don't think anyone would disagree with. Sales needs leads. Marketing original function historically, probably 80 years ago, was primarily to be able to give leads to sales. That was
at least within the B2B function.
At least within the B2B function. So no one disputes that this is kind of a time immemorial job that has always happened between sales and marketing. And you watch Glengarry Glen Ross, and like that's the entire premise of the movie. But the MQL is a lot more recent than that. And I think we think of it as like, oh, it's a recent kind of relatively recent concept, but it's a relatively recent way of addressing a far older problem. And I think it's probably where that separation is probably important.
Well, and, it actually comes out of a paper written by a consulting firm 20 years ago. So it was introduced is part of the SiriusDecisions demand waterfall model that gave us so much stuff that doesn't work. And this is just one. And and they've have been flogging this thing for 20 years. I mean, Forrester bought them. Now Forrester is flogging the same ideas. But this year officially the MQL turns 20. So in one more year, it won't have to keep using a fake ID to get into the bars.
So then what then was, because it's lasted quite a long time. And the question that will always kind of come up, and this is certainly the tech narrative, is, well, it no longer works. And I guess the question is, did it ever work in the format that it was designed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the other thing that is almost as prevalent as something is dead, is that something is dead because it no longer works. Because things are changing too fast, and 100% of the time those are bullshit statements. The world is not changing. The core underlying needs remain the same. There are minor peripheral things that are insignificant that change, but not the core underlying needs that drive core activity. But I think that the problem with the kind of what I call the original sin is around the question of where does the Q in the MQL comes from? Because marketing is creating some leads, so the M and the L part is not very controversial, but what makes it qualified? And I think this is the real place where it's fallen down, is that what people are realizing is that the way the leads are being qualified bears no relationship on the likelihood that they're going to close. And there's a famous anecdote from Zoho CRM, from their RevOps team back, this was probably 7-8 years ago, where they had this very, very complex, elaborate lead scoring mechanism to decide, when is a lead in MQL and when it should be passed over to sales. And so one of the things that the RevOps team did was that they started going through the contact database and using a random number generator to just randomly select names. And then they would use the random number generator to just randomly assign them lead scores, and then mix those in with the leads that they were the MQLs that were passing over to sales from the official scoring mechanism. And what they found was that there was no difference in the close won rate between the leads that had been scored with a random number generator and the leads that had been scored with their complex points-based lead scoring system. And I think this is a great example of where the problem lies. The problem is in the queue. What are we doing to qualify the lead? And again, I think the original sin there is this notion that basically that engagement data equals intent data. And it's so baked in that no one ever uses the actual true term for what the data is, which is engagement data or behavioral data. Everyone just calls it intent data. But the problem is there is no such thing as intent data. Intent is an unobservable internal mental state. It is something that lives inside people's heads. And until we can reach the point to where we can, saw the top of people's heads off and look down inside their brains and see intent, there is no such thing as intent data. It is an unobservable metric. And so what people have done is they've gone and they've tried to find other data that they can get their hands on, and then build a story around the fact that this other data will tell us what the intent is, that it acts as essentially a proxy. And so historically, this has been tied, or, the phrase I use is that the MQL has been shackled to the corpse of intent from day one, that it's built around this assumption that, that more engagement is going to somehow translate into a higher likelihood that they're ready to buy right now. And, one way to look at the absurdity of this is, with the standard kind of HubSpot standard lead scoring system, that, if I downloaded 2 different crappy ebooks and someone else downloaded 1 crappy ebook, I would officially be twice as likely to buy. If I downloaded 10 crappy ebooks, I would now be 10 times as likely to buy. Does downloading 10 ebooks really make you think that someone is 10 times as likely to buy? But that's exactly what your lead scoring system is trying to tell you. And the question there is of the data, the digital data, because this is the other thing, is that what we're relying on is essentially digital data that we can get our hands on and that we can de-anonymize to either an organization or to a person. And so it's not just digital data. It's a tiny subset of digital data that I can de-anonymize. And so the question then is there enough information in de-anonymized digital data to allow us to reliably tell things, predict things about a lead, including how likely they are to buy at all and how likely they are to buy now? Because there's sort of two pieces, what people call ICP fit, which is, is this someone likely to ever buy in the category? And then intent, are they likely to be buying immediately? So we can, have our BDRs pounce on them. And, and so this is what I call implicit and explicit behavioral data. So explicit data is we're capturing an action like a click or a download. Implicit data is data that we're capturing about some usually offline action. So for instance, they have a new job, they got an investment round, but only a tiny fraction of these events ever make their way into the form of digital data that we can then capture and de-anonymize and attribute to a particular organization. And so the real question comes down to, and I think, after 20 years of failing at this, I think the answer is pretty clear. The real question is there enough information in the data for us to be able to determine these things? And to what extent can we determine fit and intent based on the digital data, or what we can find in the digital data? And closely allied to this, I think, is the other classic mistake that people make, which is assuming that data is the same thing as information. Data is not information. Data is a bucket, an empty bucket that may or may not contain some amount of information. And if your bucket doesn't have any information in it, just because you got 10 times as many buckets or 100 times as many buckets doesn't mean you suddenly have a lot of information. It just means you have a lot of buckets. This is the fallacy of the AI driven MQL. AI can hoover up all these extra signals. Well, does 10 times as many signals mean you're 10 times more certain about things? And I think clearly the answer is no, because we would see the evidence. We can look at very long-term benchmark data from Gartner around what the sales funnel, the B2B sales funnel looks like, and and what we see are very, very low conversion rates from MQLs. And in fact, the conversion rates are roughly, are essentially compatible with the assumption that the best that marketing can do is to tell you whether or not they're in the broad ICP. So you look at the conversion from MQL to SQL to op to close won, close loss. What you see is and you assume the 95-5 rule. What you see is that the best that marketing is doing is likely making a good guess as to whether or not this contact is likely to buy at some point in the future, but they can't tell you if they're buying now.
So that's a really important point. And there's some really good comments that I want to use as a way of making this even more complex than it probably should be. But I think there's a couple of things that are worth saying. I think firstly that the big problem that I think a lot of the market has come around to accept, the industry, is that one of the main problems with the MQL was that, to your point, we were equating engagement with marketing as an increasing likelihood that we've gotten them to be ready to buy. And that obviously, I think for the most part, I would love to say we've moved on from that. But if anything, I think the attribution vendors are still clinging on to that, but now at an account level where we're saying this many touch points before somebody becomes a buyer. And so we're still thinking deterministically. There's no question. But I think a lot of the accepted problem with the MQL had been that just because you read 3 ebooks and opened 5 emails, you are now more likely to buy than you were before you did that. But I think what's coming up in the comments is, I think what sales cared about more than anything was, are they buying right now? And so we've swapped, and a lot of where intent data, or what we're calling intent data, has come in, has been, well, put aside all of the engagement stuff. Let's bring in signals that say these people are not only a good fit, but they're also a good fit who happens to be in market to buy. And that's becoming what a lot of the narrative has shifted over to. So there's kind of 2 things happening. One was the old world of where the MQL was really bad, which was that we were just trying to accrue score points by sending them emails. But the new narrative is about, yes, but ultimately all of that was still in pursuit of the same thing, which was in market readiness so that we can give people to sales who are actively buying.
Right. And I think that, what sales really wants, because salespeople are very realistic. They know that almost everyone they're going to talk to will never buy from them. Again, we go back to the Gartner benchmark. The benchmark number for, a fully qualified sales opportunity to go to close one is in the 15 to 20% range. So that means that, anywhere from, 5 to 7 people that you talk to only, that you are fully convinced is worth fully investing your time as a sales rep to trying to sell to them. Only, 1 in 5 to 1 in 7 ever actually closes. So salespeople understand that this is a probability game. What they really want isn't some certainty of, are they in market right now? What they want to know is the lead I'm working on now more likely to result in a positive outcome than this other lead that I might be working on. So again, it's this, what I call thinking in bets, that can the scoring system give me a lead with an increased probability of resulting in a close. Now, the false promise has been, we can tell you when they're in market. The bigger false promise from the demand creationist is that we can force them into market. If we can, strap them to a chair and force feed them crappy ebooks, crappy ebook downloads, like we're force feeding a goose, that this will force them to go from not having a need to now being, ravenously ready to buy our stuff. And, and this is the whole lead nurturing fantasy, is that, and it's a weird kind of reverse causal logic, in the sense that you start with the assumption that someone who downloads 5 ebooks is 5 times, which is literally what a points-based scoring system tells you. Someone who downloads 5 crappy ebooks is 5 times more likely to be ready to buy than someone who downloaded 1. So if we can just trick them into downloading 10 ebooks by just bombarding them with the giant spam cannon, then this will somehow magically make them ready to it. And again, it's sort of like, there's the classic correlation is not causality example of drownings at the beach are highly correlated with the sale of ice cream cones. So the idea here is that if you want to have more drownings at the beach, what we need to do is to build out a lot more ice cream stands. I mean, this is literally the logic behind combining the points-based, engagement-based lead scoring system with a lead nurturing system. It makes absolutely zero sense.
And I'll try to be empathetic to the effort, and I'll try and be the positive devil's advocate. I think, like from a sales point of view, what they want ideally is they want, if a lead is handed over to them, number one, be the kind of person who can actually buy this product. That is obviously like the base level. There's the second one, is someone who is actively interested in buying right now, because I don't want to waste my time on people who are not. And the third ideal state is people who also know us and have hopefully a positive impression of us to begin with. And I think they're more likely to compromise on the last part because salespeople go to trade shows all the time, hoping to find people who are the right kind of buyer and who are actively looking for a product like this, and they'll make up for that last piece. But I think a lot of the lead scoring was in pursuit of saying, and this lead has done all of these things with us, therefore that's a good approximation for it. They at least know who we are. Which, like, I get the logic behind that part. It's the readiness and that we deterministically force them in market through that effort is obviously false.
I mean, and there's a central fallacy behind all of this, which is that need is something that marketing can conjure up with advertising, as opposed to, demand emerges from an internal need that we have no ability to control and no visibility on. And the classic phrase is that, your advertising did not get married to buy the box of cereal. The empty cereal box in her pantry is what got her to buy the box of cereal. That needs emerge internally. What marketing can do is give people options for purchase. But the other thing in here, in terms of the engagement data, because the engagement data, I think, has value, but it's been, no one ever calls it engagement data. They just automatically call it an intent data. And now there's this been typical thing that marketing people do, which is when something isn't working, the first option is to just give everything a new name, but keep doing the same stuff. And so all of the nonsense blather about signals, if you ask them, well, what's a signal? Well, it's digital data. From where? Well, from a click. So how is this different than what you were doing before? Oh, it's totally different. It's not engagement data. It's signals. And, and there's no expectation it's going to work any better. But I think the one thing that you do get from looking at engagement data is, let's say I'm running a site and I'm selling software to accountants. And I have somebody who has, visited and read 15 blog articles on my site. And I've got someone else who's read one blog article. The person who's read 15 blog articles is significantly more likely to be an accountant than to be, say, a welder. The person that read only one might be a welder. They might have just one question, found you on a search, but they're not going to keep coming back and re-engaging. And so I think the thing that engagement data gives us is this person someone who's likely at some point in the future to buy from the category? And I think that is useful. And if we assume that all of the lead scoring and all of the intent data, that's the only thing that it's delivering, the only information that it's delivering, that is fully consistent with the Gartner benchmarks around the sales funnel. That, the sales funnel looks for all the world like marketing is handing over, the MQLs that marketing is handing over are merely people who might buy at some point in the future. And then sales has to thin those out through direct human conversation with a BDR to determine which of these people are actually interested in buying now or in the near future. And so I think that all of the signal blather and all of the intent, the engagement data blather is useful information, but only in terms of defining whether or not they're in the broad ICP. But then the bigger question is, just because they might buy something that looks like what we sell at some point in the future, it leaves several questions unanswered. Because one is, are they likely to buy it right now? Because again, we know with the 95-5 rule that, if I've got a bucket of 100 contacts that I know are in the ICP, only 5 of those are likely to be in market right now, with no easy way to determine which ones those are. The second thing is, just because they're likely to buy something that looks like what we sell, how likely are they to buy it from a company that looks like us? And I think this is a huge question that goes unanswered in B2B. And the example I always go back to is HubSpot versus Salesforce. If we look at the overall market share between the two companies, HubSpot has about 7% market share. Salesforce has about 35% market share in the overall market. But in the Fortune 1000, Salesforce has an 85% market share. and HubSpot has a 0.4% market share, less than a half of 1%. And the reason why is that large companies are strongly averse against buying from small companies. Large companies want to either buy from other large companies or they want to buy from market leaders. Salesforce is considered, in the smallest tier of CRM providers. Now, they may be the largest in the small tier category, but there's a whole large category section led by Salesforce. There's a mid tier with companies like Adobe and Microsoft. Microsoft's probably in the large category. And then there's the small tier that, it has HubSpot and then lots and lots of much smaller ones in it. And so if I'm a Fortune 1000, if I'm a lead from a Fortune 1000 company, I may be highly interested in buying a CRM, but I am highly disinterested in buying it from HubSpot. And so that's a really important question that there is data available to answer that question, which is how likely are they to buy from someone who looks like us? Then the second point is, how likely are we to be able to successfully sell to someone who looks like them? This is a more subtle point, because even if you have two identical companies of the same size selling absolutely identical products, what you see is that sales teams tend to double down on past successes. So if they get good at selling to a certain type of buyer, so for instance, they may get really good at selling into like healthcare and government accounts because they have highly bureaucratic procurement processes that sales has to engage with. And this is a skill. It's like dribbling a basketball. You get really good at it by doing a lot of it. And so you may have one company that's really good at like healthcare and government accounts, another company that's really good at things like industrial and manufacturing accounts. And and so the analogy I always use is that with sales teams, every sales team tends to either be leg day every day or arm day every day. They tend to over focus on developing skills in certain areas, largely based on, and it's not a bad thing, but it's largely based on doubling down on the historical successes and their learnings from those historical successes. So now you've got multiple pieces. Are they likely to buy from within the category? Are they likely to buy now? Are they likely to buy from someone who looks like us? And then are we likely to be able to successfully sell to someone who looks like them? So a lot of this comes down to really what I call buyer-seller fit. And so how matched is the willingness to buy from us and our ability to sell to them matched? And this is going to be unique to each individual company. It's not some sort of a generic measure based on how many ebooks you downloaded.
So on that point, I would be doing a disservice if I didn't try and challenge your thinking. Because the argument now is what you are sort of saying, which is that we are selling to companies and companies buy things. And within those companies, not just one person buys, but there are groups of people responsible for the decision to buy something. So the argument is that we should be marketing to qualified accounts as opposed to qualified leads because there are more people involved in complex decisions. Why is that not the right direction?
Oh, I think that is. I mean, marketing should be marketing to qualified accounts. But the key word is marketing. Once it gets to sales, that's a whole nother universe. So the moment that you move from marketing activity to sales activity, salespeople, no salesperson ever in the history of sales says, I'm going to ring up Google tomorrow. I'm not going to talk to any people at Google. I'm just going to directly talk to Google itself. And salespeople do not have sales conversations with corporations. They have sales conversations with humans that they can actually reach and have a conversation with. And so, just because you think that an organization might potentially buy what we're doing, that doesn't really give the salesperson anything that they can work with. They need, a name of an actual human with a phone number or an email address. Now, going back to how likely are they to buy, if I've got, if there's a lot of activity looking at our product or products like our product, then it's highly likely that this company is going to be, potentially buying at some point in the future. It doesn't mean they're going to be buying today. But, if you go back and you look at the MQA, marketing qualified account, which is the classic kind of, the MQL is dead. We're all going to go to MQAs. What is an MQA? An MQA is to take the same exact failed points-based lead scoring system, and instead of saying we're going to add up all of the crappy ebook downloads from one person, we're going to add up all of the crappy ebook downloads from 10 people that are all working for the same company. If it doesn't work for one, it's not going to work for 10. You're basically still building everything on this flawed foundation that engagement is a measure of intent. That if I download 10 ebooks, I'm 10 times more ready to buy right now than if I only downloaded one. The other flaw in this that never gets addressed, and in fact, not only doesn't get addressed, the companies that are selling this data do everything in their power to make sure that no one ever even asks the question, which is if I have 10 people downloading stuff, from, within the category, what does that mean? Well, if you're dealing with and first of all, this assumes that you can de-anonymize. The ability to de-anonymize to a named individual remains fairly poor, maybe in the 5 to 20% range. The ability to de-anonymize to an account is still pretty poor, maybe in the 50 to 75% range. Most of what goes on, we cannot de-anonymize to a name. In a large part, we can't even de-anonymize to an account. But let's only look at what we can de-anonymize. If I have 10 people downloading stuff and I can identify 10 unique individuals that are doing this from a company, what does that mean? Well, if it's a 15-person startup, it probably means a lot. It probably means that there's a really, really high interest in that company. If it's a 250,000 employee, Fortune 100 company, doesn't mean a thing. It's just background noise. And so what matters is, is there a sudden increase in the volume of downloads above the background noise level? So in other words, if I'm if you've got 250,000 employees, there are probably 20 to 50 people Googling damn near anything every single day forever. And so what is that? So if there are 50 people a day Googling something in my category, and suddenly that jumps to 500 people a day, that might mean something. But, that becomes very, very hard to detect because, again, your ability to catch all the data, your ability to de-anonymize it to a particular account, these are all challenges, which means that if you could actually perfectly see everything, and a lot of these lead scoring mechanisms are sort of predicated on this assumption that you have perfect godlike visibility of every action that occurs. And, if we could perfectly see everything and we knew what the long-term background, kind of the background radiation level was, and then there's suddenly a spike in it, that could give us useful information. But none of the companies give us that information. In fact, they go out of their way to hide this information. And they're probably hiding it because they know that if we could see the real numbers, it would not be good for them. And so, again, this goes back to how much actual information can we capture, within the data that's available to us, because data is not information. Information is something that would allow you to do future projections. The example I always give is, if I know the last 10 outcomes on a roulette wheel, that's some data, but it gives me no ability to guess what the 11th spin on the roulette wheel is. If I know the last 100 million outcomes on that roulette wheel, I have a lot more data. I have no more information. I still cannot use that information to predict anything. So I think this is the huge nonsense behind a lot of the AI based, lead scoring and lead management stuff out there, which is just because I can gather 10 times as much data and do it 10 times as fast doesn't mean I have 10 times as much information. I may have, I may start with zero information and end up with zero information. And again, think about the roulette wheel. If I have, if I have a database of the last 1 million outcomes on that roulette wheel, it will not tell me anything about what the 1 million and one spin will turn up. It's still going to be random. And I think that's the challenge, is getting people to understand that data is not information, and that what we're really looking for is to try to shift the odds of an outcome, be able to predict that if we work on certain things, we'll have a greater probability of a positive outcome than if we work on other things. That it's really about this notion of thinking in bets.
So on that, and I want to make sure I do as much honesty to the arguments against the MQL as possible. And there is another one. And I'm seeing a lot of the narrative coming through in the comments here, which are very valid ones. Because I think, again, there are two very different sides to kind of what makes up, whether it's an MQL, LLA, whatever it happens to be. One is this account in market? And that's what all of the signals narrative is coming around to. I want intelligence that is first party, third party, that shows this account is researching this topic. All signs point towards the fact that they are interested in this kind of a solution. That's like an intelligence layer of however accurate you want to say it is or isn't. The idea is we want to know, is this account looking like they are planning to buy something like ours? And on the other side of it, there's the leads that come from marketing to sales. And the goal is we want to only put the best that are in there. And so there is an argument, and this was very much the marketing demand creation argument, which was, don't waste your time on scored MQLs because they're junk. Only hand over people who explicitly raise their hand to talk to sales. Form fills that come through, they're the only MQL that matters because the only intent is the one that was explicitly given to you by a prospect. So from that argument, that's what an MQL should be in its purest form. And then there's an intelligence layer. But why is that not enough then?
So I mean, I think there's a couple of issues here. So just because someone does a form fill and raises their hand does not mean they have any intention of ever buying from you. And I'll give you some specific examples. During an earlier part of my career, I did consulting work with some very large Fortune 100 global procurement groups. One of the things that was part of that work was sitting in on many, many dozens of buying committees behind closed doors, looking, as an observer in that process. And one of the things that you would see is there would be typically two consideration sets. There's the initial consideration set, and then there's the final consideration set. The initial consideration set was typically 2 to not more than 3 products, and pretty much everyone had already gone in deciding which of those 3 they're going to get. But procurement would typically require 5 to 7 bids. And so at some point, someone goes and tells the junior summer intern to go and find me 5 more companies that look like these 2, because we gotta we gotta throw something on the sacrificial altar of procurement. And so they will go and fill out forms, do the hand raise, set up meetings with salespeople. No one in that process ever had the least intention of buying from these people. All they're doing is they're just rounding up some sacrificial goats to sacrifice to the gods of procurement. So, and you see this in the sales side, that what a hand raiser, if I'm a rep, what a hand raiser gives me is a slightly better bet, that I'm putting my chips on a better hand of cards than if it was just a random person, selected out of the contact database. But there is absolutely no guarantee that they're going to close at any kind of a reasonable rate. And I think the key thing here is really, what's the division of responsibilities within the organization between marketing and sales? If you think about marketing as having 2 arms, there's the brand marketing and performance marketing. So making people aware you exist, and in a way that they will see you as an option. Brand marketing is about putting you into people's initial consideration set. It's about being that 1 to 3 companies that they know they're going to buy from before they ever even start the procurement process. Performance marketing is about giving companies an opportunity to get into the secondary, the kind of the final procurement set. And they didn't think of us automatically, or they didn't remember us automatically to put us in the initial consideration set. But if we can hit them at the right time and remind them that we're an option, or show them that we're an option, we could still get pulled into that secondary set. Now, we're going to have a lot lower chance of winning than if we'd have gotten in the initial consideration set. But marketing's job is essentially not to produce closed-won deals. That's sales' job. Marketing's job is to simply get us into the consideration set of as many buyers as possible who are likely to buy from someone who looks like us. And so brand puts us in the initial consideration set. Performance marketing puts us in the final consideration set. But it's up to sales to make the case for why we should be chosen as the one that got bought out of the consideration set. And so it gives you kind of a very clear hierarchy there. But so I think everything, especially all of the brand marketing, that's going to increase the chance of being in that initial consideration set. Because who are those hand raisers? A lot of the hand raisers are people that we know we want to buy, and this is the first person I thought of, so we're going to go and ask to talk to a sales rep. But the problem there is, if you're a small market share brand, because this is the other issue, is that small market share brands are small because they show up in relatively few consideration sets. So your probability of being in a consideration set is roughly equal to your market share, or roughly proportional. I wouldn't say equal, proportional to your market share. One of the really interesting stats out of the Gartner data is that this 15 to 20% closed won rate. Once the account has been qualified and the internal organization has decided that it's worth making full investment in trying to sell to them, you still have a 15 to 20% close rate. But that 15 to 20% close rate is the same for our company with 2% market share as it is with 20% market share. So why do you have the same close rate if you have a tenfold difference in market share? The reason is that 2% market share company is only showing up in a tiny fraction of consideration sets, where that 20% market leader is showing up in every consideration set. And and so as a result, I lost my train of thought there. So the key thing there is that what keeps you small is the fact that you are seldom showing up in someone's consideration set, because they either didn't already know you existed, or at the time that they were ready to buy, they didn't encounter anything that you had said or done that made them think of you and to consider. And so marketing has a job of trying to maximize the probability of being in a consideration set.
So you just said a few things that have set off some light bulbs in my head, and I think it reflects what I'm seeing in some of the comments as well, which I think there's two really important things. One, which generally I like the sort of attractive part about marketing, and the part that we obviously agree with, is that one of the big jobs is brand marketing. It's putting thoughts into people's heads, creating memories, and eventually becoming part of a consideration set. It's all the Ehrenberg Bass Institute mental availability stuff. But there's also the reality that if you're a small brand, that takes a long time to happen, and doesn't happen quickly, especially for products that people buy once every few years and that they take months to purchase. So there's still things have to happen in the short term. That's why salespeople go to events. That's why salespeople cold call people. There's still opportunistic conversations have to happen while mental availability is being built up. And this, I think, is kind of the missed part. A lot of where the pendulum swung, especially on the demand creation side, was that, and I see this in one of the comments, why do we need to hand over anything? Shouldn't we just be brand marketers and be purists, and our job is to go out and plant memories, and then all of those memories will come back to us in the form of hand raisers who are highly engaged and ready to buy. But there's a gap in the middle, which is the enablement of sales to go and have conversations with people opportunistically while that's being developed.
Right. I mean, you're going to have very little opportunity to grow if you're not actively doing stuff to put yourself in a larger number of consideration sets. And again, that's the heavy lifting that performance marketing does. That it's actively doing things to try to, reach that 5% in the magic window, so that they'll think about you, once they're about to or actively in market. Even though you still have you're holding a relatively poor hand compared to, your competitor who was in that initial consideration set. So the question is, do they think about you on their own, or did you do something to remind them at the right time? And, and that's really the split between performance and brand marketing. But they're both in service of the same end goal, which is we want to maximize the percentage of buyers that put us into their consideration set. And so, so I think marketing has a very valid function, but at the end of the day, it still is left with this problem of, we're hoovering up a lot of contacts. We know that most of these are, many of these are never going to buy. And most of these are, even if they buy, they're not necessarily going to buy from someone who looks like us, and they may not be ready to buy for years. And we still have to figure out, of all of this, all these contacts, who are we going to pass over to sales? Otherwise, we just give them the whole bucket and say, our job is done. It's up to you to figure it out from here. And sales essentially has to then just start from scratch with no historical information. So, the question is, so I think you still have to have an MQL. A sales rep needs to have the name of a human with contact information that they can reach out to. You still have to have a scoring system, because you still have to be able to make some kind of a decision about what's ready to go over to sales, and then of all the things you pass over, what's the ranking of those things? Which of these items should they be focused on first, second, and third? Because sales doesn't have infinite resources either. If you had infinite salespeople, you just hand them the whole bucket of contacts and just let them sift through it. But, unfortunately, you don't have infinite salespeople, and you don't have infinite marketing dollars. So what we want to do is to, develop leads that have the highest probability that we can close them, and then pass over to sales the ones that are going to produce the greatest return for the sales investment that has to be made to attempt to close them.
Now, I think the nuance of what you're saying there, though, is that it's not about a point system that says, I can say with confidence this person is ready to buy right now, but more that this person is far more likely to buy from us and be a successful outcome. Is that
right.
fair?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's like you're dealt a poker hand, and you have to make a decision on whether to bet or fold. And whatever decision you make is not going to be made with understanding, with a knowledge of what the outcome is going to be, because it's completely probabilistic. But that, if you're holding 3 aces and a couple of other cards, you probably have a better shot at winning that hand than, if you're holding, a couple of 2s and a couple, a 3 and a 4 and a 5. You've got to look at the hand, and you've got to make a guess as to, should I make a bet or not make a bet? Should I bet or fold? Because that's essentially what an MQL is a decision in a poker game. Do I bet or fold? And so what you want to do is to try to get information that tells you sort of where you are on that probability spectrum, and to ideally pick the ones where you've got a better chance of winning, and it's worth making that additional investment just to keep raising, because you think that the investment is going to give you, there's a higher probability you're going to get a good payoff from making that continued investment to keep raising. Otherwise, you fold the hand, and you don't keep don't keep spending the money. And that's essentially what passing a lead over to sales is that we've made the decision that we're holding a good enough hand here that we're gonna raise the bet and keep playing, versus, we're gonna fold the hand, put the contact back in, and keep sending stuff to them to keep reminding them of the brand. So it's very much a thinking in bets sort of process.
And I guess on that, is it fair to say that requires a different relationship with sales on how they're supposed to think about these MQLs and act on them? Because I think a lot of the current scoring version of it is a call these leads today, I'll give you a new batch and call those ones tomorrow. Right. These ones aren't quite ready, let me just warm them up a little bit more. You're thinking of it in terms of these are the best odds of success. The timing isn't in our control.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the problem, is I don't think you can extract information from the data about timing. But what you can do is you can extract a lot of information about, are they likely to buy at some point in the future? Are they likely to buy from someone who looks like us? And are we likely to be able to sell to someone who looks like them? And I think those are very, very important pieces of information that can let us know that certain hands are worth raising and other hands are worth folding. I'll throw one other anecdote out. Anyone listening, go to your browser and download your entire page view history for the last month. Look at how many pages you viewed and how many sites you viewed. Now look at what percentage of those sites you bought something from. It is probably, a tiny fraction of 0.1%. And again, this goes back to, just because we can see people do things in a digital environment doesn't mean that we can gather any kind of information about how likely they are to buy. So if I had your personal browser history for the last month, would I be able to predict who you're about to buy from next week? And the answer is no, because there's so much noise compared to the tiny amount of signal. The few sites where you actually ended up buying something that they sold, your behavior on those sites look so indistinguishable from your behavior on, the next 1,000 sites you visited where you were never going to buy anything, that there's no way to pull out of that data information that you're about to buy something from that site, or from that, from the company that controls the site. And so, I think that argument, people need to look at their own behavior, because you're making assumptions about your buyers that are so radically at odds with your own personal behavior that is completely nonsensical. Look at how you behave, and then decide, even if I had a godlike AI program that could track every move I made, and the AI program is sifting through, all 8,000 page views I did last week, it's not going to be able to figure out who I'm going to buy from next week, because people that I'm never going to buy from, I'm behaving in ways that look just like the way I'm behaving towards sites where I do have intention to buy. And, and this is the challenge we have, because we're trying to look at historical data to make a prediction about future outcomes and about future, literally intentions. And, and so there are certain things I think we can do with clarity, like, I think we can reasonably predict that someone is slightly more likely to buy at some point in the future, but we know from the 95-5 rule that 95% of those people, roughly, are not buying anytime soon. But I think we can reliably predict, are they going to buy at some, they're going to buy something that looks like what we sell at some point in the future. But then the bigger issue is, just because they're going to buy from something, again, something to think about is that if you have 2% market share, then, because we know that market share tends to be highly stable, even within strongly growing categories, relative market share between competitors is highly stable over the span of many years. If you have 2% market share, that means that everyone who actually buys, only about 1 in 50 will buy from you, no matter what you do. And, so it's always a game of probabilities. Now, again, that 1 in 50 that buy from you, you may only see 1 in 10 that are actually going to buy it all, and that then takes you back down to your 20% close rate, but you're only aware of a tiny fraction of people who are going to buy at all. And then only a fraction of those are ever going to buy from you. And so, the question is, how do we score these leads? And this is what we're going to talk about next week. How do we go about scoring these leads in a way where the information is available and we can get the best, understanding of, are we holding a good hand or a bad hand? Is the hand good enough? Not that it's going to win, but is it good enough that it's worth, putting some more chips on the table? Or, is it not good enough to do that and we should just fold and wait for the next hand? So, and I think this even applies to hand raisers. Now, there's so few hand raisers that you kind of want to go after all of them anyway. But there's nothing magical about a hand raiser. The highest probability outcome for a hand raiser is that you will lose the deal.
I've never heard it put that way, but actually that's really true.
So they're useful. Now, they're valuable because you're less likely to lose the deal than if you just randomly plucked a name out of the CRM. So the knowledge that they're a hand raiser has great value, but that value is not in the fact that they're going to buy, because the highest probability is that they're not going to buy at all, or they're not going to buy from you. But they're much more likely to buy than if I just plucked a random name out of the database. And and so then the question is, how can we score leads in a meaningful way that actually increases our willingness to keep, putting more chips on the table to try to go after them?
Yeah. So this is no surprise to either of us, but we're now an hour into our 20-minute session. So I want to do these. One, I want to kind of just leave space for, like you said, there's a lot of things to take this conversation to the next part, including there's some really good comments that I want to make sure we gather, because I think there's a lot of points of view that are worth addressing in the next session. But I guess two parts. Firstly, for the sake of absolute clarity, you're not being facetious in the title of this. You do not think the MQL is dead. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But a deterministic timing created MQL in favor of a probabilistic, bettering the odds.
Well, I mean, and I think the MQL is a structural necessity. As long as you have a department called sales and a department called marketing, and marketing produces leads that sales works on, there will always be a handoff point. And you can call it an MQL, an MQA, an MQO. You can call it Bob. Doesn't matter what you call it. At some point, marketing has to use the information that it has available to decide, am I holding a hand that's worth raising or folding? If it's worth raising, if it's worth making an additional investment, then we're going to pass it over to sales, because sales is in the business of making those additional investments to try to close the deal. If it's not worth making that investment, then we just keep sending them emails. And, and this is the absurdity of the MQL is dead argument. Yeah. It's just because you have a flat tire doesn't mean it's time to haul the car to the junkyard and put it in a crusher. You just fix the tire. It's like the car is still perfectly good. You just need another tire on it. And it's the same thing with the MQL. Just because we've been driving around with 4 flat tires doesn't mean there's a problem with the car. And it doesn't mean that we don't need to get around in a vehicle. It just means that we need to put some tires on it that work. And, and so that's really the discussion here is, what does it look like to change the tires on the car as opposed to just sending the car to the crusher and staying at home from now on?
I love that. So tell us about next week of where we're going to take this conversation.
Well, I think the next step is, what are the factors that define the likelihood that define the fact that a lead is more likely to be worth a sales effort versus less likely? Because that's what we're really doing. We would like to selectively pluck out the ones that have the best likelihood of a good outcome. and have that be the ones that we're making the sales investment into. So what are the factors that are going to decide that? And then of those factors, which factors can we actually gather data that have sufficient information to help us with that? So obviously one of the factors is, are they in market? And the deal is, I can promise you, anyone who claims they can tell you who's in the 5% is selling you pure snake oil. If we could have figured that out by now, I mean, we are many trillions of dollars into MarTech investment, over a quarter of a century. Trust me, if anybody could have solved that problem, they would be multi-billionaires already from having solved it, and we would not be having this conversation. So clearly, there is never enough information to reliably tell you who's in the 5%. So there are very important things that are going to influence the probability of a successful outcome that we simply don't have access to the data. And again, intent is real. People actually have intent, but just because something exists in the world doesn't mean we can see it or measure it. But then there are other things where the data is available to us that we can go into that data and extract information that will let us make a better bet. And this is all about, I'm holding 5 cards and I'm looking at these cards and I'm trying to decide, do I raise or fold? So it's all about how do we make decisions that increase the odds of a good outcome? And then what information do we have? So again, if you're a poker player, everyone has a set of 5 cards they're looking at, but you don't know what any of them are. You don't know what cards are still in the deck. So you don't know what, if you draw more cards, you don't know what's going to come off that deck, and whatever you draw is going to be random. So there's all of these things that if you knew it, if you were had magical godlike omniscience, you could make a lot better decision. In the same way, if we can magically know exactly the right person, right time, right place, we can magically know that the moment someone was thinking about buying something, and we could pick up those brainwaves with a special brainwave radio, and then we could just immediately go and call them up right now, we would sell a lot more. But this is a sheer fantasy. And so the deal is, there's lots of information that's out there that we have no access to. There's certain information we do have access to. So we're looking at the cards in our hand. We don't know what cards anyone else is holding. We don't know what cards are still in the deck. And we don't know what cards are on the top of the deck. And so, but we can still make a decision about whether to raise or fold by just looking at the information we have available. And so that's the thinking process that I think people need to go through in terms of how do you actually go about scoring leads. And this is a radical departure from the last 20 years of trying to, of essentially being shackled to the corpse of intent and constantly playing Weekend at Bernie's, constantly trying to get him to be the life of the party. And I'm sorry, Bernie's dead. He is never going to be the life of the party. You need to move on and do it a different way. And so the question is, how do we do that?
I love it. So we're going to be kicking these back off. We're back on a weekly schedule. So same time next week, same bat channel.
Yeah.
We had a quick question. This link obviously will work for anyone who wants to replay it after the fact, but there was a question about a download in the AI world of being able to get a transcript and chuck it into Claude and get a recap.
Yeah, we'll come up with something like that. So we'll have this. One of the things we're looking at is rolling this into a podcast series and into a YouTube series. So hopefully over the next week or so, there'll be, all of this will be in alternative forms that you can in fact download.
All right. Amazing. This was fantastic. Thank you, everyone. And thanks, Dale. We're back. I love it.
I know. And thanks everybody for showing up. This has been great. Until next time.